into it. I'm a chairperson of this panel. My name is Kuba Szymański. I'm chairman of Seafarers Hospital. And I believe we all know where we are, and we should have everybody here. So this session, I'm just checking, hold on. Yes, so Seafarers Hospital has commissioned some study about well-being of seafarers. And if you think about the session we had just finished, there was talk about whole meeting today is all about collaboration, sharing, and so on and so forth. And I think previous session paved beautifully path towards our session today now, because we will be talking with our guests here, panelists, about how we can collaborate, what do we do, how do we do things, and what we can do better. But also, Tim will present the research survey we have just done and what we can do with it as well. So we will be asking audience as much as we can for collaboration, for input from you. But before I go into the panelists and open the floor and ask Tim actually to present, I would like to share something which I have to admit I'm a bit embarrassed. I only read this book very, very recently. And the book was written in 2014. And look at the dates. 1860. Yeah, you can see 1960. And can you believe that in 1860, some of the things have been started and haven't been finished yet? So we are on a way. Here is the author of this book, by the way. And I need to thank Tim very, very much for summarizing, getting a lot of history behind. And for the serving seafarer, it is an eye-opener. I didn't know the history of many things and why they are here, what happened, what we have been trying to do with it. So I strongly recommend for anybody who is either new or old to the shipping industry, read it and see how far we went in the last 100 years and how far do we have to go. For example, with hours of rest. Hours of rest, fatigue. We're still 1860, by the way. Yes, indeed, unbelievable, but it's very, very true. Now, we do have only 60 minutes, I believe, so maybe I shouldn't talk too much. I should step down and allow Tim to get us into the research we have recently done, and then panelists will help me with driving this panel. So, Tim, without further ado,
okay,
please.
Thank you very much, Cuba. Thank you. I shall look forward to increased royalties. He wasn't on commission for that, despite being a ship manager. I'm just going to give a brief introduction. Quite a lot of what I said was covered very well in the last session about the use of evidence, but I'm going to focus particularly on health. Because to me, if you're concerned with health risks, there are some core questions that you're asking all the time. What matters? What are the risks? What works? Which interventions make a difference? And who cares? Who is actually going to fund the resources needed to answer those questions? And I think that follows on quite well from the last session we've had. Now, Cuba's pointed out I have an interest in history, so I'm going to look at this with some examples from a slightly historical perspective. First of all, colour vision. This is a very long-running issue with seafarers about what level of colour vision do they need to do their job safely. What you don't realise is that probably 5% of males are turned down from work as seafarers because of colour vision. That's a pretty big bit of discrimination. Women, it's much, much rarer, but it hasn't increased the numbers of female seafarers yet. But there is a big discrimination, and it's one, because it happens before people start their careers. All those who are in the industry minimize because they've all been tested. And if they're not, don't have good colour vision, they never come into the industry. So this, I'm telling you this one because it's a safety critical issue, and some health things are, and this is a classic one that is. And it's got a very long history. There were ship casualties in the 19th century, a celebrated case that went as far as having both Churchill and Lloyd George to answer parliamentary questions on it. And then the Board of Trade spent money on doing tests on Shoebury-Ness marshes in 1910 and developed what have been the colour vision test methods for the last 100 years. Now, they've stood the test of time quite well, but we totally failed to get international agreement on them when we were introducing new fitness standards for seafarers with the ILO and IMO. There are now much better test methods available on screen, and one of my retirement interests has been how these have been developed. And there's a real challenge of industry inertia in the safety critical area. One aspect is getting better colour vision tests in place. The other aspect is actually asking what levels of colour vision are needed in today's shipping industry, because they may not be the same as those in 1910. So this is a long-run issue. It's not a crisis issue, but it's been around as a niggle for a long time. We've heard quite a lot about infections today. And one of my historical interests has been looking at infectious diseases in seafarers. And in merchant shipping and fishing, there's been a reluctance to look at infections. I've looked back. There's huge mortality from the Spanish flu in 1919. Nobody investigated this at all. Cases of smallpox were quite common in port cities because merchant seafarers didn't have the same vaccination regime that the Navy had. TB was in denial as a risk to merchant seafarers for about 40 years. So how can we learn our lessons about modern-day infections? And we've had 3 crises. COVID isn't the first. We've had HIV, and then Ebola, and then COVID. And there are going to be more. So what research do we need to put in place so that we're ready for bloodborne infections, respiratory infections, foodborne infections when the next epidemic comes? It will be a bit of a crisis, but if we've actually learnt the lessons and researched them from the past, it can be a smaller one. Yet another example, which leads in to the study I'm going to mention, is about psychological well-being. Now, I thought I should put this graph in. It's as yet unpublished work, but it's actually showing the trends in suicide rates in UK males and in UK seafarers. And the bottom line are the seafarers on UK ships. Now, you might think this is counterintuitive. It may be. And in fact, it may even be deceptive because of the way P&I clubs and insurers work, that if somebody is recorded as a suicide death, benefits are a lot less than they are if it's recorded as a disappearance at sea. So I'm suspicious of this data, but at the same time, it's quite significant. And a lot of the discussions about mental well-being end up on issues of suicide. So where do we go from here? It's actually very difficult to study psychological well-being. But the Seafarers Hospital boldly went and commissioned a study which has quite a limited review, which was done by Yale. But this was followed by a series of roundtable workshops which identified a lot of the deficiencies in seafarer health, psychological well-being. And this is quite interesting because this had a lot of different interest groups involved. And what was said earlier, it's now got a degree of sign-up. There is a set of issues that can be handled. And the Society has now produced a new document which you'll all be receiving, I think, soon, Seafarers' Health, On Course for a Culture of Care, where what we're trying to suggest to the industry, and it's really for discussion at this stage, is that you need to adopt a series of key performance indicators covering, first of all, your statutory requirements for seafarers' health, medical care on board, TMAS support, training of seafarers. Secondly, health promotion initiatives for seafarers. And thirdly, decent working conditions that don't compromise psychological well-being. So this is something we're putting out for discussion now, and we're going to hope we can have lots of comments back. So these are the elements of this culture, these three areas. And my final closing thought is, don't forget fishing. There may be 2 million people in maritime transport in the world. There are probably 30 million in fishing. So there's a lot more. So that's my contribution to get the debate going. I shall now sit down as a panel member and listen to other people. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much. And before I call Hazel to present her opinion piece, I would like to set a scene a bit for all of us and ask you, audience, a question. Who would be brave enough to put a hand up and say you are representing ship owner today? Excuse me? Not a single hand is going up? Here we go. Thank you, sir, for being brave. On a second call, he had a second thought. Yes, thank you. How about P&I clubs? Do we have any representation from the P&I club here? No way. Guys, come on. You have to be here. We're talking well-being of seafarers. No? How about charterers? Gee. So are we talking to converted? It's just us, isn't it? Well, you've got ship managers here, okay? So what's going on here? Tim is absolutely right. In his book and today, we need to think how we are going to progress with all our findings. How can we actually get these guys? The good thing is, I haven't asked how many regulators we've got with us, because Hazel will put 2 hands up and say, here I am. MCA is actually saving the day, not only for UK, but for other places in the world as well. And I have to say that, again, like I was singing praises for Natalie this morning, Hazel seems to be our spy in MCA. We've got somebody who is actually working there, keen ear for the seafarers, very keen to come back, cooperate, find out, and so on and so forth. So, Hazel, I'll start with that thanking you, then you find time for us, and you are actually today with us, and as you can see, I've just paved again, saying there's not many interest in business, unfortunately. So we need to change that. I think this is what I'm trying to nudge you and myself. This is where we really need to work together. Hazel, now, you heard Tim, and what MCA is actually doing. What would you like to share with us today?
Thanks, Cuba. So as Cuba says, I'm Hazel, Seafarer Safety and Human Element Policy Manager at the MCA. So looking at all kinds of seafarer safety issues, code of safe working practices, that kind of thing. And then on the human element side, seafarer well-being's been a sort of a hot topic of ours for the last few years. So sort of recent wins we've had, we recently launched the Wellbeing at Sea tool, which is a tool for ship owners to use voluntarily. It helps them to sort of understand the picture of well-being on board ships, and also gives sort of direct, immediate feedback to seafarers. So we're really proud of that. In terms of sort of research, which is what I've been asked to talk about today, we don't actually have a research department, but we do like to do evidence-based policy where we can. So that's where the sort of the collaboration comes in, and we're really trying to draw on the work that's been done elsewhere in the sector, and also support our own where we can. So we recently worked with Department for Transport and Ipsos Mori, who you probably know from doing the census and that kind of large-scale research. But we worked with them on some work around seafarer suicide, and in particular, not just looking at sort of the data there, because we know that the data we have in terms of how prevalent it is very patchy. We're not very confident, similarly to Tim's point, in how that's actually been reporting. And we really wanted to understand why our data and that of others wasn't sort of accurate, and look at how we can potentially sort of improve it. The other thing that triggered interest in this research was the proposal from AMSA at the ILO that there be a central database of seafarer deaths on board, and that would specifically include a category on seafarer suicide. So we wanted to understand some of the sort of barriers and opportunities there, and make an informed decision about that policy proposal. As I say, it's qualitative data, so it's really about getting the sort of diversity of opinions sort of across the sector as much as we could. One thing that we found is we had really great uptake of people wanting to actually participate in the study and speak to our researchers, which just shows what a great sort of community there is, and that there is interest in sort of improving these things. Sort of just a few key findings. We got quite a lot of background information on sort of the usual things about suicide and it being linked to seafarer mental health and rooted in that. Some of the possible sort of reasons for a uniqueness around seafarer mental health compared to the general population. But really we wanted to delve into those reasons for perceived underreporting. So there was quite a consensus, although it's not clear whether the seafarer population is at greater risk or not of mental health issues and of suicide. Regardless, it was still quite clear that everyone was in agreement that there were many reasons why it would be underreported anyway. So Tim's mentioned one in terms of insurance and perceptions around insurance, and that need to sort of protect the family. But there's also, the researchers found the stigma and issues around sort of organisational culture, and this fear that seafarers would lose their employment if they spoke up about themselves or colleagues having these kind of thoughts, or any kind of mental health issues. And a few other things that came out from the research was that proactive support is really what's needed, and there's quite an appetite amongst that group that was interviewed for those sort of more preventative measures. The reactive support that seafarers currently get, if, say, a colleague dies by suicide, in a way wasn't really appreciated. It felt sort of that those kind of worst case scenarios force ship owners' hands, and they were quite keen to see more proactive strategies sort of throughout people's tenure on board. And finally, and it's a point that I've always tried to make in the work that we're doing, is that link between seafarer well-being and that it's an organisational issue and linked to safety culture. And there seems to be a growing understanding of that. It's limited at the moment, but there's a significant number of people in the industry starting to make that kind of link, and that really seems to be the way forward in terms of, again, that sort of proactive approach. So that's just a few things I wanted to mention from that research.
Thank you, Hazel. Thank you very much. And Neil is from CERC, and we have been working together for some years now. And what I like about Neil specifically is that he is not shy to go to sea and actually work with his subjects. So he sails with us. And that is brilliant. That's probably one of the best practices we can encourage anybody who works with seafarers to actually go to sea, sail with us. And if you really want to do that, come to me and I'll arrange that for you, okay? So you can go for 2-3 weeks or 1 month, you sail, and then we will make sure that you are not relieved on time. So you would know what it is as well, okay? That's extra bonus. So you will then, well, a few things will resonate with you. Neil, over to you. Your research and what is your take on our subject?
Cuba, thank you for that lovely introduction. As Cuba said, I'm from the Seafarers Research Centre, and what we focus on is the human element. I'm going to pick up on something that both Tim and Hazel have talked about in suicides. I'm not going to go over what they've said already. They're exactly right. Suicides are underreported, and it's due to the stigma of having a family member commit suicide, and also the loss of any financial side from this. In a lot of the Filipino insurance systems, if it is a case of suicide, the family gets no payout. You've lost everything. And we actually saw this when we did a mental health study for IOSH, and we actually spoke to all the 13 P&I clubs, and we were told in many cases that quite often the family would beg them, please do not put this down as a suicide. This will really affect everything for us. But another issue that I don't think we've talked on is actually suicide rates, working out suicide rates. We can actually say suicide rates in the general UK population. We just pretty well know how many people live in the UK and other countries. Try and find a number of how many UK seafarers we've got. Try and find a number of how many global seafarers we've got. The figures you see around, and I won't get into the technicalities of it, are at best estimates of how many seafarers there are. The problem with this is that means that you cannot get good. The suicide levels could be really high in seafarer populations. They could be actually fairly good. We don't know. And the final, sorry, I'm a statistician as well, so I'm a bit nerdy when it comes to this. The other thing is there's different classifications. Missing at sea. Quite often, you're on the middle of a ship in the middle of the sea. If you go missing, it's not often due to accident. You've probably sadly thrown yourself over the side. But if you cannot prove there was suicidal intent, it isn't classified as a suicide. That very artificially lowers the suicide rates. So I'll get off the numbers. I will talk about our mental health study we've done. Actually, I'm going to skip between. We've done quite a few different studies. We've done one looking at just health in general at sea, and we did a survey in 2006 and then again in 2016. We did the same with accommodation, which I will dip into. If you bear with me, I'll tie it all together into a coherent story. And we've also done a thing about mental health. Just going to the mental health, we know there is an issue of seafarers struggling with their mental health, but what we don't often know is what's causing this, what is making seafarers unhappy. And recently, actually it's not that recent, it's a couple of years ago now, we actually went to the seafarers missions. I went to the seafarers missions in Germany, in Felixstowe, and I sat there for a couple of weeks at a time and spoke to seafarers. I didn't get them to fill out surveys to say how high their anxiety levels were, their depressions. What I asked them is really simple questions, but quite fundamental. What makes you happy at sea? What do you like? What makes you unhappy at sea? What makes you happy at home? And through this, we actually managed to sort of build up a picture of what people's priorities for happiness are. And it comes to things on board the ships. It is isolation, and me and Cube, we discussed this quite a bit, and I think we probably will later now. Seafarers feel isolated at sea, and there's different types of isolation. This can be isolated from a family at home, and this comes down to things like a lack of communication, not having good internet facilities on board. It's to do with not being able to get off the ship. This is especially a problem in COVID. Seafarers haven't been able to leave the vessel to actually go to the missions, which are really good sources of contacting home. So there's this loneliness and isolation, not only from the family, but also on board. Seafarers are so busy nowadays. The first thing I noticed when I started going to sea is you get on the ship and I'm wandering around and I don't see anybody. People are either working or asleep. Being on a ship can be quite isolating as well. And we used to have, in the good old days, I'm not that old, but I've heard about this, we had these bars on board and you'd have social events. That's gone now. We don't have bars. Not every ship's a dry ship, but you don't often see bars available on board. But what you do see, and what we find from our research, which is really, really, really effective, is having get-togethers, barbecues on deck. And I know certain types of vessels, you can't put a barbecue on the deck. It's not a good idea. But it really, really, really helps. It brings people together. It's not, if there's we didn't have any ship owners in here, did we, Cuba? It doesn't cost anything to put a barbecue on, to put a social event on. It's $50. But it really helps bring from the lowest cadet to the captain together and actually speak to each other and find out. It brings that social interaction. It brings that happiness together. And I've seen it on a ship. I went on, it was a ship that had just changed crewing from Filipino crew to Chinese crew, and they were all new to each other. They didn't know each other, but they had a really good captain on board. And what he did every week was on the Sunday, they would all get together and make dumplings together. It was really nice, and they had a little row going, so it'd start with the captain who would fill them up, and then they would fold them together, and then the cook would cook them. But and he allowed everybody to have a beer together. And the social cohesion you got in that ship was amazing. And we can do things about isolation. We can do things about mental health. But to get back to where we are now, we're not doing it very well at the moment. Because, as I said, we did a survey of mental health in 2006 to 2016. And when we actually looked at cases of mental health, I'm not talking severe mental health cases, I'm talking someone who's slightly unhappy, that's doing a disservice. It is showing a clinical case of anxiety or depression. How many seafarers do you think show cases of either anxiety and depression at sea? And this is from data in 2016, so it might have changed. But anybody have an idea? No. 36%. We found 36% of seafarers. I think that's quite high, actually. It's sort of a bit higher than we found in the general population at the time. And that's a worrying condition. Perhaps we should do something about this.
But did you go actually to find out why? I think I immediately probably could answer that. Well, because if you look at your employment status, you don't worry about Monday. You know you will be working. You are on unlimited contract, aren't you? But why I'm not when I'm at sea? I finish my contract and I know it is going to be 4th of July and then I'm unemployed. How would you feel when you go on holiday and then you don't know whether you've got to work or not? Yeah. Wouldn't you be a bit anxieted? Yeah. I think you would. So that's 90% of all seafarers are hired and fired. So the company doesn't have to say then you are fired, you are just not employed, not re-employed. And that creates a lot of people not going TikTok or whatever now, but going and checking, okay, what is my next employment? Shall I make sure then? So it probably creates that sort of insecurity.
That is one of the biggest, when we looked at what makes people unhappy, it was job insecurity. It was one of the biggest one. Am I going to get a contract when I finish this? And it also goes into other fields as well. It's to do with safety on board. If you're a seafarer and you've got to get a new contract, even if you see a dodgy, unsafe practice on board, you're not going to mention that because you're going to be black marked and you're not going to get another contract.
You think you will be black marked actually because you don't know that, but you know it's a natural human being activity to believe that.
It takes a good culture of safety to actually install in people that you can bring up these issues as well. And it's a shame there's no companies here because the best thing you can do is react positively to any issues that, and even if you don't agree with it or even if you don't make changes, explain to that person so that they're sort of what they have seen is they can see it's taken seriously. That is something I'd recommend. So.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you. And I would like now to circle back to what Tim was saying about our Yale research, which you either received already or you will be receiving. And you will see something which I would like to make a comment. This was commissioned to go through literature review. So Yale, Mark, went through the studies and everything he could find in the public domain. And that doesn't mean this is what seafarers want to be researched. This is what academia wants to research. And watch out, because you will not find there issues we were just talking about. There is hardly anything research-wise about job security, which in my opinion as a seafarer is the most important thing. The other thing would be being relieved on time. If I promise my wife, and probably more importantly, my kids, then I will be home for Christmas, and I'm not, they don't get it. They think that daddy doesn't want to be with them. And there is a pressure on me, because I know it's not true. But how can I sell it to them? That creates a huge anxiety. Why this is not being researched? Because today, in our panel, we are supposed to talk, what are we going to do with the research we have done? Where are we going to go with this? Is it the task for charities, or is it task for those who are not in this room? Owners, managers, P&I clubs, cargo owners, and so on and so forth, charterers. So these are the areas which I am trying to lead you to your own conclusions, okay? Now, we have Francesco with us today, and Francesco is actually a technologist as far as I'm concerned. They have done big research, and not only that, they come up with solution, and it's called telemedicine. Francesco, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and of course to the organizers for the invitation. I'm Francesco Menta, and I represent the International Radiomedical Center, CIRM, which is the Italian Telemedical Maritime Assistance Service. We were established in 1935. At the moment, I'm the president of the institution, and my first predecessor was Guglielmo Marconi, the inventor of radio, who had also the idea to use radio, his invention, for medical purposes. After the introduction of radio, it was possible also to assist patients on board the ships. We should always consider that from a medical point of view, in terms of medical assistance, a ship at sea is the most isolated environment in the world. So it is difficult, definitely, to provide medical assistance to ships, as ships, at least cargo ships, they don't carry doctors or health practitioners on board, and medical assistance is delegated to the hands of the captain, who can do something, but definitely now, thanks to the development of telecommunications, there are the telemedical maritime assistance services, probably about 20 of these services working worldwide, and using telecommunication systems, we can provide medical advice to ships, which is a very particular situation. Each of us knows his or her doctor. We have a tactile contact with the doctor. This is not the case of people on board the ships. We have never seen our patients, and probably we will never will. Our eyes and our hands are those of the captain or of the first officer, which are our partners in medical assistance at sea. Now technology can help us very much. We can see patients, we can receive medical data, but unfortunately, from a cultural point of view, we use more or less the same approach that was used 100 years ago. So very, very old-style approach. In general, people from a ship say that we have a patient with 39 degrees Celsius fever. What to do? Okay, you can understand that it is not easy to manage this. So it starts a relationship of communication. Please let me know if you have a pain on joints, if you have a sore throat, and so on. Different situations. You have to consider this one, that our center assists more than 7,000 people at sea per year. Each assistance requires approximately from 5 to 8 teleconsultations. This means that we approximately 50,000 medical visits on board the ships, And now there are several points. First of all, the collaboration from the ship side is not the best that we can have. For instance, in the 30% of cases, people don't report the age of the seafarer needing assistance. This means that really, from a medical point of view, if you don't know the age of the patient, it's not so easy. Then from where are you coming? Where are you going? When will you arrive? It is very important. As medical assistance at sea hasn't to be considered just diversion of the ship, as another big problem to carry medicines that are required to be carried on. In the middle of the ocean, there is no the pharmacy open. So for such a reason, it is important to carry many, what is necessary. And what is necessary. Frankly speaking, we don't know exactly the pathologies affecting seafarers, as modern epidemiological studies were not done. So for such a reason, it's really very difficult. A main problem is also another one. In general, the telecommunication systems, they use the telephone for asking for advice in urgent cases, but from our side, okay, we can provide instructions over the phone, but we use also written messages, as for prescriptions is much more useful. Ships use email, which is the cheapest way for communicating, but from a medical point of view, certainly email is not the best way for preserving confidentiality of medical information, which is another big issue. So probably we have a lot of technology today. What we don't have is still an adequate culture for the problems. Each ship officer with medical duties, he should have some courses called medical care on board. These courses last 40 years, 40 hours, every 5 years. So this, you can't imagine the medical knowledge of these people. For such a reason, from our side, thanks to the ITF support, we have developed a software which is called the Marine Doctor, and it will start from October 1st this year. Collecting all the information for approximately 50,000 medical cases assisted by us. Then, using artificial intelligence, we have extracted the data, and then the system guides. I have a deck, so please, before sending the request, look at this, look at this, look at this, and in this case, you can report to the doctor more precise. This is one aspect. We can see patients. We can have electrocardiogram, pulse rate, everything very simply collected, but we have technology. From the ship side, we still don't have no technology from the other side. So I think that we should do incredible efforts in terms of culture. We need more training, as the technology is available. And so we need more training, and we need also, it is important to replicate in a technological environment what, as a doctor, I can do in my daily practice. So it is a very important, as the course of culture is the speed of culture is very low. So we need to speed up if possible, and to have a better cultural approach. You have to consider this one, that, for instance, if you spend the time in educating people, at the end you get good results. For instance, we took hygiene in the kitchens. We start sending the instructions, keep this, okay, and then we went to inspecting the kitchens. At the beginning, the results were not encouraging, and so we complained. After 3-4 years, we see that the kitchens are more clean. This means that if the message is conveyed in the proper way, from the ship side, the people collaborate. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I believe we've been talking for some time now. I'm keen to open the floor. Any questions, anything which you would like to share? Kate first, and then Peter, and then I see your hand as well. Well, I don't think we've got mics, so Kate, you need to shout. But Kate, how about I suggest something, because I like what you are hearing, and I think because I'm using this rough statistics, 90% hire and fire, 10% not. And my son now, for example, works for the company which is not hired and fired. So how about we do the comparison study? But then we would need to have a very well thought through academic questions. What are we actually comparing? What are we checking? And then we could take a sample of those who are employed full-time versus those who are hired and fired, and put the case across to those who are not in this room. But that means maybe, I don't see this gentleman who was saying that in 2020 there will be no need for charities. But if we did all of this, then maybe charities will not be needed in 30 years because we cure all problems. So, yes, Nick.
Is that the seafarers would choose to work for the companies that don't hire and fire. And so
some of them.
Some of most of the best seafarers with those companies.
I don't know. That's a very good thesis, I suppose. So let's do the research and maybe you can defend that. I probably wouldn't, but hey, it would be nice to know, because at the moment nobody really knows about it. Our gut feeling is then this what will happen. Okay, and I promise Peter, please, and you need to shout.
Isolation from shore, isolation on the ship, different cultures on board, different traditions, there is social integration on board, as well as the detachment you have from the shore side. You have emotional health, you have detachment from the family, you have concerns when you are not communicating, of hearing bits of information, not being able to act and take action on it. We've been hearing about physical considerations, we talk about young studies, we talk about diet, we talk about hydration, we talk about more exercise, we talk about emotional health in various forms, Sometimes we even talk about the spiritual health. I'm not going to name any one of those. But overall, it's holistic. If we really care about seafarers, we should be concerned about every aspect. And that failure of our industry to pull together holistically all the concerns that impact on seafarers is our biggest failure. Now, we haven't got a word for it, but it is what makes the seafarer well, happy. What are we talking about? Everything. Every element of that has involved. And the problem is we tend to focus on one area or specialize in that and pick a bit out there. You know, we know that when we put a healthy ship, a happy ship, it's probably a safe ship. That's anecdotal, it's not necessarily evidence proved. But are we doing enough to put it all together and actually package it so that every company, every charter, we might, let's have a code that says, you know, my ship I will charter, the ship I will use, covers all of these considerations, because we do not have a charter or a code that brings it all together. And that's what we do need, because it's great to do some wonderful work in isolation, but let's realise there's a holistic problem in many different areas. We really do need to embrace all of these considerations when we're talking about, well, the health, the wellness, the well-being of seafarers. And we fail to bring it all together at any one time.
So, Peter, I need you to help me. We need to get out of Trinity House and go to Intertanko, ICS, the owner associations, and actually play back what you just said. Because that's where the audience is, really. Okay, Intermanager came up with this ISM code, 1994. Yeah, there was a code of conduct for the ship managers. We are now revising it ourselves in Intermanager. And I'm hoping there will be KPIs, because Tim is absolutely right. Everything would be toothless if we do not put very clear instructions. What do you mean by well-being? Holistic approach. We need to put the shipping company is not happy with 4% not relieved on time. But do they measure it at the moment? A lot of shipping companies don't have a clue. I'm appalled, and I'm sorry to name names, but cruising industry doesn't know how many people they kill. There is no LTIF. Tankers, by all means, tankers would not be hired if they didn't know lost time incident frequency. Passenger ships, what is LTIF? You mean how many times we didn't have a coffee? No, we're talking about human beings being injured. And that's the culture. And I know I'm speaking within those four walls here because a lot of people don't get it. And we definitely need to do that. And that's why, Peter, at the very beginning, I did a stock check. We thank you, charity world, to point out to ship managers and crew managers and owners, this is our shortcoming. But now, please help me, you are in a second, help us to get out and actually sell it. Oh, I have plenty of hands and I've got only 10 minutes. So this gentleman, and then you, okay? And then Neil, I see you.
Thank you. Please follow my thunder. I think you raised a really good point, but my question was perhaps too simplistic, and it was, who do you think is responsible for seafarer health and well-being? And the context in which I asked that question is that a few times we referred to undertake the Foundation's World Risk Report, in which we asked who is responsible for your safety, who is tangential. And culturally, depending on where people were brought up and in what circumstances and where they were working, that answer differed significantly. It was everything from me to my family to my employer to my union to God. So, I think it speaks to the complexity of the issue that you were saying. So perhaps the question is, who's responsible for convening all of the different parties to...
So I'm prepared for this question, and I would put finger here, and I said employer. An employer at the moment in shipping industry is crew manager. The signature at the bottom of the contract is with the crew manager. The owners are clever because they arm's length. But if crew manager is happy to pick up on this, then crew manager has to be responsible. Crew manager is then ship manager. Ship manager has to have balls to go to the owner and say, sorry, I'm not getting my people on your ship because it's substandard. But it wasn't happening until now because there were too many seafarers, although many organizations were trying to tell us there is a shortage of seafarers. And I would like to smuggle one piece of information for you. We heard that there is a crisis in Ukraine. You also heard that Ukrainians are not allowed to go to sea. So 5% of Ukrainians shouldn't be at sea now. So that should be a 5% shortage of seafarers. Have you seen 5% ships not sailing? Then start thinking about it, okay? So there is a lot of BS about shortage of seafarers. There isn't, okay? And that's why seafarers can be treated the same way. And if you still don't believe me, check how the pay rises at sea are faring, okay? Are we getting any salary increment? On LNG ships, maybe yes. Okay, I'm talking too much. You, please.
Thanks very much indeed, Kira. And a really, really very good panel. Thank you very much indeed to everybody. I'm an international lawyer, and I am here as a representative of human rights at sea. My principal concern here is that, and I'm not as familiar as some with the community that I've been sitting amongst today, despite my human rights at sea affiliation. My biggest concern in this context is the extent to which, and you raise the issue of who's responsible. There is a massive vacuum in terms of responsibility in maritime terms, generally speaking. You mentioned the cruise industry just a few seconds ago. Let me relate to you a case of a couple of years ago. Panamanian registered vessel in the Western Mediterranean. A 17-year-old British girl was allegedly raped by an Italian male over 18. There wasn't a massive age difference between the two, but that's not the case. The vessel then went into Valencia, and the master, unusually, as in our understanding, reported this particular crime to the authorities ashore. The Spanish police investigated and placed the accused in front of the Spanish court. The court dismissed the case completely because it didn't have jurisdiction. The crime was committed on the high seas, on a Panamanian registered vessel. The Spanish court simply did not have jurisdiction. Now that's just one story of a human rights problem at sea in terms of jurisdiction. We talk about regulations, we talk about standards, we talk about guidance, we talk about all sorts of things, and I'm delighted to see the Maritime Coast Guard Agency here, and the various different legal issues that have been raised over the last few hours. The problem I've got with a lot of this law is that it's largely unenforceable. I know that we've got port state jurisdiction in relation to things like the Maritime Labour Convention. Of course I'm aware of this. I'm absolutely not convinced that the law that we have, and I look at all of the international instruments that govern the shipping industry and govern the fishing industry and govern other aspects of maritime industry and so on, none of this is really effectively enforced. And as far as I can see, there isn't a single state, my own included, despite Robert Cork's presence here this morning, and he's taken an interest in the work that we've been doing in human rights at sea, that's for sure, but he's only one junior minister in the British government as a whole, and we need considerably more than one junior minister to take an interest in this for the UK, to take a serious interest in the whole thing. One of the other problem areas, as I see it, is the shipping industry itself, that doesn't want a lot of these issues raised. Why do masters of cruise ships not report crime at sea? The largest cruise ship now has got almost 10,000 people on board, 2,000 plus crew, and the rest made up of passengers. There is no effective police force on board these ships. Any security that is there is employed by the shipping company. It's a complete mess, and it's outrageous as far as I'm concerned. I'm a former mariner myself. I was in the British Navy for 30-odd years. I'm appalled at the state of things, generally speaking, these days on the high seas and at sea generally. And I don't know what the answers are. I mean, I raise these things, and it's very, very important indeed that all of these issues are raised. They're all massively important. And at the end of the line, of course, is the seafarer.
So I have to mute you now because we've got only 4 minutes. But I would like to close it, and I see your hand as well. The thing here is maybe, because I did really think about that, if we had lawyers on the seafarer's side, for example, insurance. At the moment, we've got P&I clubs, and P&I clubs obviously are representing ship owners. So they always have to find guilt. So it has to be a blame culture. It has to be, because owner is then completely exonerated from any problems caused by the seafarers. And if we had the insurance, seafarers had insurance as an MLC instrument, then there would be lawyers taking care, and I, as a captain, would have my lawyer who would represent me. I wouldn't be spending 20 months in jail in Mexico because I did find narcotics, drugs, and so on and so forth. And then let the lawyers battle on our behalf, and so on. Over to you. You had the hand.
Me?
Yes.
Yes, hi. Sam from Sailors Society. I'm a fundraiser, so I'm not new to the charity sector, but very new to the maritime sector. So I raise this with a degree of trepidation because I might be showing my ignorance. But I was just wondering, so we're talking about the measures of looking at like suicide rates, looking at all the different kind of measures of well-being and happiness among seafarers, and I just wondered how that manifests in the KPIs, measurements, what have you, that a shipping company or a crew management company would have. If you've got a happy, healthy, well looked after crew, what are the things, then the commercial imperative of this company is that on the face of it, they don't necessarily care about that, but does that correlate with something else,
There was, as far as I'm concerned, and Tim and the others, please correct me, there was no research done on it. So if you think about this panel, the panel question was, what next? And I'm hearing you loud and clear. Then we have appetite for research into these areas. Interestingly enough, us as a charity world, but maybe that's how we need to help bigger brother shipping industry, and saying, okay, let's investigate. Would that help you to have a happy crew? Now, this book, actually, on page 17, I believe, says that in 1860, British government decided to stop hire and fire in the Royal Navy. There was no further press ganging. So the Navy decided to employ people long term. A mercantile, as it is called at that time, decided not to. So it was still, we are short of 3 people. Let's send the gang and press somebody and let them sail with us. So we are, 120 years now?
Yeah, I think the interesting one is the Navy did this expediently because the short-term seafarers were not as competent as those who had continuous service.
Yeah.
And there's a very good lesson there for the here and now.
Well, and that's why it popped into my head, because I was just remembering one of the meetings that I had when I had the pleasure of going to Macedonia, and I met with one of our corporate partners there who, on the face of it, looks like a kind of a model employer in terms of providing lots of those things, a budget, social budget for the crew that gets to something that they can input into their nutritional preferences, what have you, for the voyage, and what have you. And one of the stats, I suppose, that they told me was that they have very high crew retention, 97% crew retention. So I guess that's kind of like a directly related.
Well, we've got KPIs, there is no doubt. Peter is now laughing because I'm Mr. KPI, shipping KPIs 2011. 2011, shipping KPIs has been invented. And funny enough, I'll be very critical about my folk, we paid $10 million to invent them. Norwegian government helped, TK Foundation paid, and so on. We've got KPIs, shipping KPIs available. Nobody wants to use them. Because in this KPI, Kuba Szymański is BMI 37. That's what it is, 37, and I'm bald. And I can't say that I'm a beautiful young man, because I'm not. In KPI, I am what I am.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. No,
and that's the issue. But Peter is pointing out beautifully, charterers. Okim, for example, is actually squeezing tanker people and saying, if you don't like it, leave it, go. Ladies and gentlemen, we finished, although, yeah, we had different nationalities, but we finished. 16:32. We've got 5 minutes for others to join us. So now, free discussion, by all means. I'm delighted that we are carrying on longer. But before anybody comes, could we just put hands together for our panel? You may feel that we underutilize you, but actually you were a catalyst for this discussion. Without you, there will be no traction like that. So thank you, Francesco, thank you, Neil, thank you, Hazel, and thank you, Tim, for being with us. And now, yes.
Please respond to the Seafarers Hospital Society document. It is tentative. We need your help. Cuba's got a whole lot of new KPIs. They were delivered free and at no cost by me having a brainstorm one morning.
Indeed, indeed. Yes, he will email you, yes, indeed.
Can I just say that if you don't think you would normally get an email from the Sailors Hospital Society, then leave your details in this email.
That's right, well done, indeed.
Make sure that you do get something.
Yeah, we will be sending it spraying from the hip, obviously, to all friends and colleagues. But if you believe that we don't have your email address, Rina is your lady. And please do come back to us with that, because it is for us. And I think you would appreciate the fact that we are responding to the call of collaboration. So we are not doing this research for ourselves only. Let's work together. We already had a few meetings. I'm looking at Deborah here and so on and so forth. And we are moving things. And I'm delighted using this opportunity now, thanking you actually for being with us today. Yeah, we finished. Thanking you very much for being here, because you actually make a difference by being here, discussing things and so on. So thank you, and thank you once again.